Beneath the heat of the Southeast Asian sun, the empire built its fortune not on gold, but on smoke. Ships drifted through tropical harbors heavy with crates marked in foreign tongues, their cargo destined to shape the pulse of entire nations. Behind ledgers and customs stamps lay an empire of quiet addiction, refined, organized, and utterly profitable. In the marble offices of colonial cities, euphoria became administration and desire became currency. This is the forgotten story of how pleasure financed power, how the dream of control conquered conscience, and how an empire learned to turn ecstasy into empire.
It began with a fragrance, faint, sweet, and strangely serene. At dusk, it drifted through the narrow streets of Penang and Saigon, curling between the shutters of trading houses and the lanterns of riverfront taverns. To a traveler, it might have smelled like peace. To history, it was the scent of empire. The British called it commerce. The Chinese called it yao, medicine. But beneath both words lay the same quiet truth. Addiction was not born in the dens of the poor, but in the counting rooms of the powerful. By the mid-19th century, Southeast Asia had become the beating heart of an empire built on euphoria. The British in Malaya, the Dutch in Java, the French in Indochina, each governed not only with gunpowder and silver, but with smoke. Opium was their diplomat, their currency, their unspoken law. Every chest unloaded from Calcutta to Singapore carried not just resin, but revenue, the sweet poison that oiled the gears of colonial control. From the glittering halls of colonial clubs to the bamboo huts by the Mekong, the drug's reach was absolute. It was the quiet equalizer of empire, erasing class in the haze of its allure. Officials, merchants, and laborers all met within its perfumed fog, each chasing the same fragile calm that empire itself could never deliver. In Penang, warehouses lined the shore like silent vaults of empire. The East India Company's seal gleamed faintly on wooden crates, stamped with neat red characters Patna Opium. Inside each chest lay fortunes, compressed into bricks of brown resin, the very substance that connected Bengal's fields to Saigon's rivers and Hong Kong's harbors. Every chest told a story of a farmer in Bihar scraping resin from the poppy's pale petals, of a clerk in Singapore tallying profits beneath a portrait of the Queen, of a Chinese broker in Malacca translating British ledgers into Cantonese whispers, and of the men in uniform who guarded it all, unaware that the empire they served was slowly dissolving in smoke. The colonial governments did not deny their trade in opium, they perfected it. In every port, official opium farms operated with bureaucratic precision. Licenses were auctioned to Chinese syndicates, who distributed the drug under government supervision. Revenue flowed upward, despair drifted downward. In reports to London, the system was called regulated commerce. In the streets, it was simply called living. The brilliance of the empire lay not in the musket, but in monopoly. By controlling pleasure, the colonial powers controlled people. The tax on euphoria became the most profitable form of governance ever devised. And behind this quiet empire stood not soldiers, but merchants, men whose fortunes were built on the human desire to escape. Some called them traders, others, more honestly, called them lords. They met in smoky clubs in Rangoon, Singapore, and Batavia, men of linen suits and pale hands, discussing prices of poppy resin as if discussing tea. To them, opium was not sin or salvation, but simply arithmetic. A chest from Bengal cost 120 to ship, sold in Saigon, it could yield 100. Profit had no conscience, only precision. Their ledgers became maps of dependency. The more they sold, the more stability appeared to reign. Villagers paid taxes more readily. Workers labored longer hours. Soldiers remained quiet. The empire discovered that bliss could govern more effectively than fear. And so, it built an administration of intoxication. Orderly, profitable, respectable. Yet even as their ledgers swelled, unease lingered at the edges of empire. In the cool hours before dawn, British officers in Saigon sometimes watched the river mist rise from the delta and mistook it for smoke. They would breathe deeply and feel a strange melancholy, as if the fog carried whispers from the lands that produced it. Perhaps they knew, even then, that history would one day see through the haze, that every coin earned carried the scent of the very substance that would one day erode their dominion. The age of conquest was ending. The age of commerce was beginning. And in the humid dusk of Southeast Asia, the empire's heart beat not with gunfire, but with the soft crackle of a pipe. The ports glowed with quiet life. Sampans drifted by like ghosts. In the distance, a gong sounded, the evening call to a world both intoxicated and enslaved by its own illusions. The merchants retired to their mansions, the workers to their shopphouses, the clerks to their ledgers. But the smoke remained, floating between worlds, neither east nor west, neither sin nor sanctity. It was the empire itself, transformed into air. And thus began the century of smoke, when euphoria became a weapon and empire learned how to sell dreams. Depended on bringing in a. By morning, the harbor at Singapore stirred like a living machine. Junker boats from Borneo glided past British cutters. Depended on bringing in a. Sampans from Canton bumped gently against the wooden piers. The air was thick with the scent of salt, spice, and that faint, bringing in a unmistakable trace of opium, the perfume of profit. From dawn to dusk, the docks sang with the rhythm of empire, crates being lifted, ledgers stamped. Depended on bringing in a. Coins counted. Here, in the glittering heat of colonial commerce, opium was not contraband. It was civilization's quiet engine, bringing in a. The men who governed this empire of smoke were not soldiers or kings. They were merchants, clerks in white suits, brokers fluent in 5 languages. Villages' very survival depended on bringing a. And middlemen who could translate both profit and loyalty. Some came from London or Amsterdam, carrying the manners of empire, bringing in a. Others were local, Chinese, Malay, Tamil born in the colonies yet skilled at navigating their hierarchies, bringing in a. The opium trade had created a new kind of aristocracy, one that ruled not with armies but with receipts, bringing in a. The bureaucracy of bliss. To understand how deep the system ran, one had to look not at the dens but at the offices. The village's very survival depended again on every barrel of poppy resin that arrived in Singapore from Bengal was accounted for in triplicate, once by the customs officer. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a. Once by the company accountant and once by the appointed farmer, a licensed dealer who rented the right to distribute opium locally, depended on bringing in a. These opium farms were not fields but fiscal monopolies auctioned to the highest bidder. They villages and very survival in bringing in a. The highest bidders were often wealthy Chinese merchants, men like Cheng Hong Lim and Tan Seng Po in Singapore, who became legends of their time. So very survival depended bringing in a. They operated vast distribution networks stretching across the Malay Peninsula, ensuring that the empire's narcotic flowed as predictably as its taxes. Bringing in a. The British collected revenue, the merchants collected fortune. Both sides smiled. Bringing in a. Colonial reports described this partnership with bureaucratic precision. The word farm gave it an air of rustic respectability, bringing in a. As though opium were a crop of civilization. Yet it was, in truth, a financial latticework, the skeleton of empire's economy. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a. The government would lease the monopoly, the merchant would supply the drug, the people would pay in coin and labor, and the system would sustain itself, bringing in quietly and efficiently. In 1 year alone, although the Strait settlements derived nearly half their public revenue from this trade. Roads, railways, Television survival depended on bringing in a. Even hospitals by the same silver that had passed through the hands of these farmers. Progress itself was underwritten by smoke. The land depended on bringing in a. The language of profit inside the counting houses of Singapore and Batavia. Ledgers became maps of the empire's bloodstream. Survival depended on bringing in a. Columns of numbers replaced borders, balance sheets replaced treaties. In the empire of trade, language mattered less than arithmetic. A village's very survival depended on bringing in a. A merchant from Fujian might not read Shakespeare, but he could calculate a shipment's and profit margin to the fraction of a tael. A survival depended on bringing in a. A British officer might not speak Cantonese, but he knew the scent of silver when it crossed the table. Bringing in a. Between them lay the true lingua franca of empire profit. They spoke it fluently. In the evenings, these men gathered at the European clubs, whitewashed sanctuaries of empire, cooled by slow fans and slower conversation. There, depended on bringing in. Amid the clink of porcelain cups and the hum of gossip, fortunes were discussed as casually as the weather. Ships delayed in Calcutta. Prices fluctuating in Saigon. Rumors of unrest in Burma. All these meant opportunity. To outsiders, they seemed like respectable gentlemen of commerce. To history, depended on bringing an A. They were architects of dependence, the brokers of a dream that had no end and no mercy. Bringing in a. The invisible empire, the beauty of the system lay in its invisibility. No armies were needed. No rebellions were fought. Depended on bringing in a. The empire had discovered a subtler conquest, one that passed quietly from hand to hand in the form of small, neatly wrapped parcels of resin. Depended on bringing in a. The colonial administrators called it revenue efficiency. The merchants called it luck. The people, of course, had no word for it at all. The villages very survived on bringing in a. In the Malay villages, the smell of the resin became as familiar as the scent of rain. In Chinese shop houses, the pipes hung beside ancestral portraits. Not as rebellion, but as ritual. Depended on bringing in a. The trade had become so deeply woven into life that to remove it would have been to unravel the fabric of society itself. And so, the empire of smoke expanded, not through conquest, but through continuity. By the late 19th century, Singapore, Penang, villages' very survival depended Ringa and Batavia had become the nodal points of a narcotic network stretching from Bengal to Borneo. The profits fueled everything. Telegraph lines, bringing in a. Harbor dredging, colonial schools, even the paper on which laws were written. Opium was not a shadow economy. It was the empire's foundation. Villages' very survival depended on bringing in a. Though wrapped in silence, the gentlemen of the ledger, the true drug lords of colonial Southeast Asia, rarely touched the substance they sold. They survived on bringing in a. They wore silk waistcoats, signed documents with imported pens, and attended church on Sundays. Their wealth was abstract, built from numbers, bringing in a. Contracts and trust. They were not villains in their own eyes, but pioneers of progress. Bringing in a. In their offices along Battery Road or along the riverbanks of Batavia, clerks copied invoices by candlelight. The ink they used, dark, oily. The village's very survival depended on bringing in a permanent, was perhaps the only honest symbol of the trade, a liquid stain that left its mark on every page it touched. The Vringa depended on bringing a. They had created a world where smoke could be taxed, where dreams could be measured in pounds and pence. The village's very survival depending in a. And where morality bowed politely before the promise of profit. The empire's new nobility did not inherit land or titles. They inherited markets. Very survival depended on bringing in a. The quiet symbiosis at its heart, the trade between the colonial government and the Chinese merchants, was a dance, one of convenience and control. Bringing in a. Each needed the other. The British required intermediaries who understood local markets. The Chinese merchants required protection and legitimacy. Survival depended on bringing in a. Together, they built a system that looked like order and smelled like money. The Dutch called their system the pact. The British called theirs the farm. The French in Indochina called it the RAG. Different words, same foundation. Each empire learned from the other, and bringing in a. Improving the machinery of monopoly with bureaucratic precision. A village's very survival depended on bringing in a, and through this machinery flowed a substance that carried both comfort and control. A paradox so elegant it seemed divine. A village's very survival, depending in a. The Twilight Ledger, as the century turned, whispers of reform began to stir in Europe. Bringing in a. Newspapers in London and Amsterdam questioned the morality of colonial revenue. Politicians spoke of reconsidering dependencies. But in the East, bringing in a. The ledgers still grew fat with numbers. No empire abandons its most profitable illusion easily. And so, depended on bringing in a. The merchants of smoke continued their work, calm, meticulous, and almost reverent. They believed themselves modernizers, not masters, depended on bringing in a. And perhaps they were right, for in the quiet balance of revenue and ruin, they had built something no army could ever conquer, dependence disguised as order. Depended on Bryn to the vine. At dawn, the mists over the northern hills of Burma rose like ancient ghosts. The mountains shimmered in a pale blue haze, bringing in their valleys veined with rivers that ran silver under the first light. To an untrained eye, it was paradise. Endless forests, tranquil villages, bringing in a. And soil rich with promise. But to the empires of the 19th century, this was more than a landscape. It was a map, a living vine of power. Siam depended on bringing in a. And French Indochina lay a region the traders called the Triangle. It was not yet known by the ominous name it would one day bear, pen and bringing in a. But its destiny was already sealed in the soil. Here poppy thrived as if nature herself conspired with commerce. The highland climate, cool and steady, whose very survival depended on bringing in a. Nurtured the flower with a precision no European greenhouse could match. Each petal carried within it the empire's most profitable secret. Bringing in the hills that stretched from Mandalay to Luang Prabang became the silent foundation of Southeast Asia's narcotic economy. A natural fortress of profit guarded not by armies, bringing in but by geography. A web of borders and bargains. The colonial map of Southeast Asia was a masterpiece of convenience. The British held Burma. Survival depended on bringing in the French commanded Indochina, and Siam stood between them, a kingdom independent in name, but entangled in their diplomacy. Bringing in each empire eyed the other across invisible lines, their ambitions clothed in the language of trade and progress. The village's very survival depended on bringing in yet beneath their rivalries lay a quiet cooperation, the recognition that prosperity flowed best when vice remained invisible. Bringing in the British extracted their revenues through the opium farms of Penang and Rangoon. The French mirrored the model in Saigon and Hanoi. The Siamese court, while Saigon depended on bringing in watching both, adopted its own version, licensing opium dens under royal authority, transforming a moral question into a financial necessity. Depended on bringing in each power claimed to regulate, none claimed to abstain. Thus, the Golden Triangle was less a territory than a concept. The village's very survival to bringing in a shared frontier where boundaries blurred and profits united. In border towns like Chiang Rai and Kengtung, bringing in trade spoke in a jumble of languages, Burmese, Thai, Lao, Mandarin, but all understood the same currency. Bring in caravans crossed mountain passes under the protection of tribal chiefs. Taxes were paid in silver, loyalty in silence. The product was weighed, packed, a village's very survival in, and carried on the backs of mules, each step a link in the chain that bound remote valleys to distant cities. The empire's smoke began in a flower, bringing in traveled through 1,000 hands and ended in 1,000 ledgers. The hills of plenty, in the uplands, depended on bringing in the poppy fields stretched across terraced slopes like pale oceans of ivory and rose. The farmers tended them with quiet devotion, bringing in knowing little of the world their harvest sustained. To them, the poppy was simply a crop, one that fed families, paid debts, bringing in and survived drought where rice could not. Colonial officials often described these hills as self-sufficient, a euphemism for isolation. Just very survival depended on bringing in few roads reached them, few laws applied. Yet from these secluded fields came the wealth that kept the ports alive and the treasuries full. Bringing in was a strange symbiosis. The empires depended on the farmers, and the farmers unknowingly depended on the empire. Depended on bringing in neither would ever truly see the other. The gateways of empire downriver, the great arteries of the trade pulsed with constant motion. The village's very survival depending on the Erodi carried goods south to Rangoon. The Mekong wound its way through Laos and Cambodia to the French docks of Cochin China. Along these routes, Denon bringing merchants built warehouses, river depots, and custom stations, the architecture of empire disguised as commerce. The village's very survival depended on bringing in each river was a thread in the vast tapestry of trade that connected inland mystery to coastal order. The hills supplied the raw product, depended on bringing in the ports refined, taxed, and exported it. The circle was complete, an economy of smoke flowing seamlessly from mountain to metropolis. Bringing in the late 19th century, a curious harmony existed between rival powers. British steamers carried goods to French ports, bringing in Siamese couriers delivered parcels to Dutch territories. On paper, the empires competed. In reality, bringing in they coexisted, each unwilling to disturb the equilibrium that filled their coffers. Profit, it seemed, was the one borderless kingdom. Bringing in diplomats and dreamers in European capitals, the trade was often spoken of in euphemism. Bringing in diplomats described it as the Oriental system of regulated pleasure. Economists called it revenue from consumption. Rarely did anyone call it by its true name. Bringing in the drawing rooms of Paris and London, maps of Southeast Asia hung like trophies. Red and blue lines marked territories and rivers. The village's very survival depended on bringing in but none marked the invisible routes of smoke that financed them. These were the hidden frontiers of empire, invisible, profitable, and irreplaceable. Village's very survival to bringing in even missionaries and reformers who spoke passionately of moral duty found themselves entangled in the paradox. Village's very survival. Many of their churches and schools in Asia were funded indirectly by colonial budgets, enriched through the same trade they sought to reform. A village's very survival depended on bringing in it was the quiet irony of empire virtue built upon vice, the balance of dependency. By the turn of the century, the system had reached its equilibrium. Village's very survival depending on the British monopolized cultivation and shipping. The French dominated regulation and consumption. Sime acted as the broker in between, bringing in preserving its sovereignty by playing both sides. This triangle of power, economic, political, and geographic, became the axis upon which Southeast Asia revolved. Every transaction, every treaty, bringing in every alliance carried within it the invisible weight of the poppy flower. For the empire it was efficiency, for the colonies, inevitability. On Vige's very survival, no rebellion could succeed against a system that promised both revenue and relief. The smoke did not need to conquer, it only needed to continue. The Vige's very survival depended on bringing in and so it did. The illusion of stability from the terraces of colonial clubs in Rangoon and Saigon. The village's very survival did on bringing in One could look out across the tropics and believe in permanence. The ships arrived on time, the ledgers balanced, the revenues rose. Bringing in The hills remained green, the rivers calm. Yet beneath this apparent serenity, something had begun to shift, depended on bringing in The hills that fed the empire had also learned its secret that power lay not in land or guns, but in control of the substance that softened both. Bringing in In the quiet valleys of the Shan states and northern Laos, local chieftains began to assert their own authority over the trade. They taxed caravans, bringing in formed alliances, and negotiated directly with merchants. The empire's monopoly, once absolute, was beginning to fragment. The village's very survival depended on bringing in It would take decades for the cracks to widen, but they had begun here, in the very heart of the Golden Triangle. Bringing in The empire's reflection. By the end of the 19th century, Southeast Asia had become a mirror of its masters. The British, Dutch, French survival depended on bringing in and French had exported not just laws and railways, but dependence itself. A system so refined it could outlast them. Depended on bringing in The poppy bloomed where their flags did, a quiet reminder that empire was as much illusion as achievement. In the morning light, the hills of Burma, bringing in Siam and Laos glowed gold, not from wealth, but from the petals that swayed in the breeze. And somewhere far from those fields, a village's very survival, the man in a linen suit tallied the numbers that turned flowers into fortunes. The empire called it progress. History would later call it something else.
By the turn of the 20th century, the opium trade in Southeast Asia had evolved beyond commerce. It had become a system, vast, intricate, and self-sustaining. Like a well-oiled clock, it ticked with bureaucratic precision. Cultivation in the hills, transport along the rivers, taxation in the ports, and consumption in the cities. Every gear turned another, and the empire's wealth moved forward in perfect rhythm. It was not chaos, nor chance, it was policy. Colonial officials did not speak of addiction or morality. They spoke of revenue stability, fiscal necessity, and public order. The language of administration transformed dependency into an instrument of governance. The empire, in its quiet genius, had learned to institutionalize euphoria. The ledger and the law in Singapore, the opium department, occupied a neat stone building facing the harbour. Its corridors smelled faintly of ink, parchment, and disinfectant, the sense of legality. Behind its doors, clerks in linen shirts recorded shipments, balanced ledgers, and stamped licenses. On the walls hung frame charts showing annual revenue, steady, predictable, comforting. There was nothing scandalous about it. On the contrary, it was the very model of imperial efficiency. Every chest of opium imported from Bengal was logged with serial precision. Each local distributor or farmer was registered, bonded, and supervised. The British called it monopoly control. The Dutch in Java called their version the opium regie. The French in Indochina named it régie de l'opium. Different words, same idea. Control the supply, collect the tax, maintain the illusion of order. Through this machinery, the colonial state achieved something extraordinary. It turned pleasure into policy and dependency into discipline. The system's success depended not on force, but on paperwork. Licenses, receipts, taxes, fines, these were the empire's invisible weapons. They bound people as tightly as chains, yet required no violence to maintain. It was governance by ink. The architecture of control in cities like Saigon, Batavia, and Penang, government opium stores resembled small fortresses, thick-walled, guarded, and immaculate. The barrels were stacked with military precision, each sealed with a government stamp to signify purity. To the casual observer, they could have been warehouses for tea or spices. Yet within those walls lay the empire's most dependable revenue stream. Officials proudly reported their success to London and Paris. Reports detailed improvements in regulation and reductions in smuggling. The document spoke of progress, of civilization bringing order to a chaotic East. But the reality was subtler. The empire had not eliminated vice, it had domesticated it. By integrating the trade into law, the colonial powers gave it legitimacy. By taxing it, they made it moral. And by administering it, they made it indispensable. The governments even introduced their own retail outlets, official opium shops designed to be clean, controlled, and profitable. Prices were standardized, quality was guaranteed, and every purchase contributed to the treasury. It was commerce presented as public service. Colonial propaganda declared that this system protected the people from unregulated excess. In truth, it protected revenue from competition. The civilizing argument to justify this machinery, the empire developed a moral vocabulary of its own. Officials and economists began to describe the trade as a form of benevolent guidance, a way to manage native habits while preventing social disorder. It was, they said, better to regulate than to prohibit. Pamphlets circulated in London and Amsterdam defending the system. They argued that prohibition would drive the trade underground, encourage crime, and bankrupt the colonies. The Oriental temperament, one report stated, requires gentle control, not deprivation. In the quiet offices of empire, the poppy flower was transformed from a moral concern into a fiscal necessity. Every argument for revenue was cloaked in the language of reform. The bureaucrats of dependency behind the polished policies were men, administrators, accountants, surveyors, who believed they were building something orderly. They filled their reports with numbers and statistics, reducing human behavior to graphs and charts. The complexity of emotion, suffering, and desire vanished beneath the calm geometry of data. In their eyes, the system worked. Crime rates were low, revenue was high, and trade routes were secure. What more could good governance demand? Every quarter, the figures arrived from across the region. Burma, 3 million rupees in profit. French Indochina, 12 million francs. The Dutch East Indies, 20 million guilders, numbers so large they ceased to feel real. Yet behind each digit lay an unspoken cost, one that the empire, in its elegance, learned not to record. The myth of protection, the colonial state claimed that regulation protected the population from exploitation. But in truth, it protected the monopoly from competition. The empire's greatest fear was not moral decay, it was economic leakage. Smuggling, not suffering, was the true enemy. Along the coasts of Siam and the jungled rivers of Borneo, smugglers thrived. They evaded taxes, crossed borders under cover of darkness, and sold cheaper, untaxed opium. To the bureaucrats, these men represented chaos, the breakdown of imperial order, and so the machinery of dependency expanded to combat them. New patrol boats were commissioned, customs posts multiplied, regulations tightened. Each new law, each new seal only strengthened the structure. The empire was building a fortress out of paper. The invisible burden for those at the top, the system seemed perfect, elegant, profitable, and sustainable. Yet, like all machines, it consumed more than it produced. The economy of dependency required constant maintenance, new markets, new justifications, new layers of bureaucracy. The colonial governments became addicted not to the substance itself, but to the certainty of its revenue. By the early 1900s, opium accounted for nearly half the total income in several Southeast Asian colonies. Railways, ports, telegraph lines all owed their existence to the same fragile flower. Dependency had become institutional, not among the people alone, but within the empire itself. The mirror of empire in the end, the opium system was not a corruption of empire, it was its reflection. The same principles that governed trade, taxation, and bureaucracy governed this commerce of pleasure. Control, profit, order, these were the pillars upon which empires stood. And as long as the ledgers balanced, conscience could remain quiet. In a speech before the Straits Legislative Council in 1906, one British official summarized it perfectly. The opium system, while regrettable in theory, is indispensable in practice. To abolish it would be to dismantle the very framework of our administration. His words, delivered with bureaucratic calm, captured the essence of the age. Empire, like its trade, was built upon dependency, elegant, efficient, and impossible to escape. By the dawn of the 20th century, the opium trade had become more than a commerce of pleasure. It was the financial bloodstream of colonial Southeast Asia. Every ship that crossed the Strait of Malacca, every coin minted in Calcutta or Batavia, and every bridge that rose over a tropical river carried within it the invisible trace of the poppy's sap. Euphoria had become economy, and economy, empire. The currency of smoke in the bustling port of Singapore, silver dollars changed hands faster than words. Merchants in starched linen coats, loaded chests, marked with Chinese characters onto sampans, headed towards Sumatra, Siam, and the Malay Peninsula. The metallic clatter of coins echoed through the harbour, mingling with the scent of sea salt and spice, but beneath the surface of legitimate trade lay another rhythm, quieter, more consistent. Opium was the silent currency that flowed through every transaction. Its profits paid for the ships that carried it, the docks that stored it, and the bureaucrats who taxed it. Each chest that arrived from Bengal represented a small fortune, purchased cheaply by the colonial government and resold at many times its cost. The margins were astonishing. It was said that an empire could rise on smoke alone. In the ledgers of the Dutch East Indies, opium revenue was recorded beside coffee, sugar, and tin, yet it often surpassed them all. In British Malaya, 1/5 of the colony's annual budget came directly from the trade, Zoaid. In French Indochina, it financed schools, railways, and even the Governor-General's residence in Hanoi. Opium was not merely tolerated, it was essential. The birth of a financial machine. As the trade expanded, so too did the machinery that sustained it. Private firms, many with European names but Asian partners, sprang up to handle logistics and credit. The House of Sassoon in Bombay, the Dent & Co merchants of Hong Kong, and the Netherlands Trading Society in Batavia all profited from the smooth circulation of the product. Banks were established to manage the flow of silver, insurance companies to protect the cargo, and shipping lines to guarantee its safe delivery. It was capitalism in its purest form, rational, efficient, and detached from morality. Every chest of opium financed a web of institutions, maritime firms, credit agencies, and commercial courts that transformed Southeast Asia into one of the most interconnected economic regions in the world. Colonial governors spoke proudly of this modernization. They pointed to the rise of new cities, Singapore, Penang, Saigon, as proof that commerce brought progress. Yet the invisible foundation of this progress was dependency. The same flower that dulled the senses also fueled the empire's ambition. The arithmetic of dependency, the economic appeal of the opium system lay in its simplicity. It required no costly infrastructure, no long-term investment in production. The poppies were grown elsewhere, in the fields of Bengal or Yunnan, while the colonies reaped the profits of taxation and distribution. It was a perfect imperial equation. Minimal cost, maximal return. Reports from the Straits settlements described it plainly. In 1905, the colony's total revenue exceeded $16 million, of which $6 million came from opium. In the Dutch East Indies, the figure was even higher, nearly 30% of all government income. To the accountants of empire, these were not moral numbers. They were practical ones. They justified budgets, funded armies, and maintained bureaucracies. The colony's prosperity, they argued, depended on a stable fiscal instruments, and few instruments were more stable than addiction. This financial dependence had an ironic symmetry. While the people became reliant on the drug, the state became reliant on their dependency. The web of trade from the hill farms of Bengal to the narrow alleys of Saigon, a seamless web connected producers, merchants, financiers, and administrators. Steamships carried the product through the Indian Ocean. Brokers in Penang converted it into local currency. Shopkeepers in the Mekong Delta sold it in tiny doses. Each link in the chain took a share, yet none saw themselves as complicit in anything larger than commerce. The farmer grew, the banker financed, the bureaucrat regulated, and the machine continued to turn. This detachment was the empire's greatest invention. It allowed everyone to profit without ever feeling responsible. The Dutch called it indirect governance. The British named it colonial partnership. The French preferred association. All three meant the same thing, rule sustained not by force, but by dependency disguised as prosperity. The economics of illusion, the wealth generated by the opium trade, did not merely enrich treasuries, it reshaped entire societies. In cities like Batavia, Rangoon, and Saigon, new districts rose, elegant boulevards, stone customs houses, and theatres glittering with imported glass. Bankers dined beside planters and officers, all celebrating the new prosperity of empire. Yet beneath the surface, prices fluctuated with each new shipment of poppy. The colonial economy had tied itself to a volatile product. A single failed harvest in Bengal could ripple across the entire region, closing shops in Penang, halting construction in Saigon, and shrinking budgets in Batavia. Dependency, for all its efficiency, was fragile. Still, the illusion of stability persisted. Reports to London, Paris, and The Hague spoke of economic vitality and expanding markets. The true foundation, a narcotic monopoly, was mentioned only in passing, buried among figures and formalities. To acknowledge it would be to question the very legitimacy of empire. The new aristocracy of commerce out of this trade emerged a new kind of elite, cosmopolitan, pragmatic, and entirely loyal to profit. They were merchants fluent in multiple languages, financiers who understood both Asian credit systems and European accounting, and administrators who moved effortlessly between cultures. In the ports of Southeast Asia, names like Orbun Hor, Oetianham, and Chongfat Tze became synonymous with wealth and power. These men built shipping empires, invested in real estate, and funded schools. They dressed in Western suits but followed the rhythms of Eastern trade. The colonial authorities admired them, even relied on them. They were intermediaries, bridges between empires and economies. But their fortunes, like those of the empire itself, rested on a fragile foundation. The flower of Euphoria, Han. The paradox of prosperity, the empire's relationship with the opium trade, was one of calculated contradiction. It condemned excess while institutionalizing supply. It spoke of moral order while profiting from indulgence. To the bureaucrat, this was not hypocrisy, it was necessity. For the empire, morality was a luxury, solvency a duty. Each time an official in Singapore balanced the colony's books or a Dutch inspector counted the year's revenue, the equation repeated itself. Prosperity through dependency. The irony was invisible, buried beneath the comfort of arithmetic. In the end, the economics of Euphoria sustained not just the colonies, but the empire's very idea itself, rational, orderly, and inevitable. The narcotic trade was not a corruption of imperial capitalism, it was its purest expression. For what is empire, if not the art of turning human desire into fiscal order? In every empire, there comes a time when administrators fade and merchants rise. By the late 19th century, the opium trade of Southeast Asia had entered that era. The bureaucrats still signed the licenses and stamped the manifests, but the true architects of profit were no longer in government buildings. They were in counting houses by the docks. Men who understood that the empire's stability depended on the rhythm of trade, not the rhetoric of policy. They were the merchants of modernity, pragmatic, adaptable, and fluent in the language of both East and West. The hybrid elite, the ports of Singapore, Penang, and Batavia were their kingdoms. In these humid, cosmopolitan enclaves, cultures overlapped like the tides. Chinese junks anchored beside British steamers, Tamil traders unloaded sacks of rice next to Dutch inspectors, and European bankers walked through alleys echoing with the calls of Malay vendors. Within this swirl of sound and commerce, a new class emerged, men who could navigate multiple worlds without belonging entirely to any. They were Chinese compradors, Arab financiers, Indian moneylenders, and Eurasian brokers. The indispensable intermediaries who kept the colonial machine running. Many began as minor agents for European firms. They translated contracts, managed warehouses, and arranged credit for local buyers. But over time, they mastered the mechanics of empire better than the empires themselves. They learned how prices fluctuated with monsoons, how bureaucrats could be persuaded with efficiency rather than defiance, and how silver from Canton could finance goods in Calcutta. They spoke softly, dealt privately, and built fortunes that rivaled those of their colonial employers. For the new commercial order, the opium trade gave these men their first great opportunity. Where the colonial powers imposed regulation, the intermediaries provided flexibility. They operated the distribution networks, collected payments, and managed the smaller opium farms, not fields of cultivation, but retail monopolies licensed to supply towns and villages. Each license was a miniature empire. The farmer paid the government a fixed sum for the right to sell, and in return, the administration guaranteed protection and exclusivity. Success depended on the delicate balance of price and loyalty. A shrewd farmer could turn a modest investment into a dynasty. In Malaya, entire families rose from the proceeds of these operations. In Java, Chinese-Indonesian houses turned opium profits into investments in sugar, shipping, and real estate. In Indochina, French officials quietly partnered with local businessmen who understood how to manage demand without drawing attention. The result was an economy that appeared diverse but was bound together by a single thread: dependency disguised as enterprise. The architecture of wealth, the wealth of this new class, was visible everywhere. Mansions with carved teak doors and imported chandeliers lined the streets of Georgetown and Batavia. Steamship companies with hybrid ownership, British registration, Chinese crews, Indian investors, carried the goods that fueled the empire's arteries. In the evenings, these merchants gathered in colonial clubs, speaking in polite tones about shipping rates and harvest forecasts. They were careful never to mention the true source of their fortunes too directly. Opium was the foundation of prosperity, but European administrators began to rely on local magnates for loans, political mediation, and even philanthropy. Schools, hospitals, and public fountains bore the names of these merchant families. Their generosity softened the image of empire, giving dependency the veneer of progress. The colonial powers, in turn, rewarded them with titles, medals, and invitations to official banquets. The merchants of modernity had become symbols of a successful collaboration, proof the empire claimed that trade could civilize and profit could unify. The illusion of partnership, but the partnership was always uneven. For all their wealth, the local magnates operated within invisible boundaries, created within invisible boundaries. Their influence was tolerated, even celebrated, as long as it served imperial convenience. When profits rose too high or ambitions grew too visible, regulations tightened, licenses were revoked, and alliances shifted. The empires were careful to keep the structure intact, dependent but stable. No merchant could exist without imperial sanction, and no empire could function without the merchant's skill. It was a perfect balance of necessity and control. Yet within that structure, something remarkable occurred. These merchants began to transform their wealth into something more enduring than money: legitimacy. They founded newspapers, funded schools, and invested in shipping lines that carried not just opium, but textiles, rice, and tin. The economy that had once revolved around the poppy began to diversify, cautiously, quietly, but irreversibly. The empire, without realizing it, had helped create the seeds of its own evolution. The shadow of modernization. By the early 1900s, the colonial economies of Southeast Asia looked transformed. Railways linked plantations to ports, telegraph lines connected islands, and trade flowed with unprecedented speed. But beneath the new machinery of modernity lay the same old dependency, only now it wore the face of respectability. The opium wealth had not vanished, it had merely changed form. It financed insurance companies, rubber estates, textile mills, and shipping fleets. The merchants who had once sold pleasure now sold progress, yet the profits they reinvested still came from the same chemical source, the flour that blurred the line between prosperity and indulgence. A Dutch report from 1908 described this transformation with bureaucratic pride. The revenues derived from the opium monopoly have enabled the Indies to undertake extensive works of public improvement. The prosperity of the native population is thereby advanced. It was an extraordinary paradox. The empire's modernization, its ports, railways, and schools, stood as monuments not to virtue, but to dependency perfected. The human equation of commerce behind every ton of exported tin or bale of rubber lay the arithmetic of trade. The silent calculus that began with the poppy fields. Few spoke of it, yet everyone understood it. The system had created not only wealth but identity, a sense of belonging to the machinery of empire itself. The merchants of modernity had become both its beneficiaries and its custodians. They built schools their children would later use to study European economics, ships that carried goods to imperial markets, and estates that symbolized an empire's success. But in the end, their prosperity remained tethered to the very structure that limited their freedom. They were not rulers nor subjects, they were shareholders in dependency. The mirror of the modern age as steamships replaced sailboats and telegraphs replaced letters, the rhythm of commerce accelerated. The merchants embraced it, adapting to every new technology and fashion. They saw in empire not oppression but opportunity, a vast interconnected system that could be navigated with skill. In doing so, they became the architects of a new order, one that blurred the lines between colonizer and colonized, virtue and vice, profit and morality. And as the empires congratulated themselves on their civilizing mission, they failed to see that the true civilizers were these quiet figures at the docks, the merchants who turned opium smoke into modernity's foundation. And by the late 19th century, the empire had turned its ports into monuments, gateways through which both wealth and illusion flowed. Here, on the edge of continents between sea and city, the machinery of colonial commerce revealed its truest face. From Saigon's boulevards to the quays of Singapore, from Batavia's canals to Rangoon's docks, every stone, sail and shadow whispered the same story. Power gilded by pleasure. Anra gilded by pleasure. The city as a stage, each colonial port had its own rhythm, but the melody was familiar. Ships arrived with the tide, steamers bearing chests from Calcutta, crates from Canton, and rumours from London. Dockworkers shouted in a dozen languages, their voices echoing off warehouses heavy with goods and heat. Above them, clerks in white coats recorded every entry, every coin, every chest of regulated opium. The docks were the empire's pulse. Every bale of tobacco, every barrel of oil, and every chest of poppy resin carried not only commerce, but control. As the afternoon light softened over the harbours, the city awakened into another form, one made for display. One made for display. Colonial administrators strolled through European boulevards lined with gas lamps and ornate arcades. Carriages rolled past facades modelled after Paris or Amsterdam, their shutters drawn against the tropical glare. Beneath this performance of civility, the engines of dependency continued to hum, silent, steady, and unseen. Singapore, the calculated crossroads, no city embodied the logic of empire more completely than Singapore. It was the centre of the Straits settlements, a colony built not on land or agriculture, but on movement. Here, geography became strategy. Ships from India, China, and the Dutch East Indies converged in a single harbour, turning the island into the empire's central exchange. The colonial government claimed it as proof of progress, order, trade, and law brought to the tropics. But progress in Singapore was built on precision. The opium monopoly financed its docks, its police, even its schools. The government auctioned licenses to wealthy merchants, who then managed distribution under strict oversight. Every chest imported was logged, taxed, and sealed. A ritual of legality masking a commerce of dependency. At night, the harbour glowed with lanterns and the steady pulse of industry. Clerks worked late, the scent of ink mixing with the sea. To the empire, it was the smell of civilization. To history, it was the scent of quiet exploitation dressed in efficiency. Saigon, the mirage of elegance farther east Saigon, the Paris of the Orienter, embodied another kind of imperial vision. Wide avenues lined with tamarind trees, villas painted in pale ochres, cafes where officers discussed philosophy over imported wine. It was France reimagined through the haze of Indochina. But beneath the facade of elegance, the same machinery turned. The French Régie de l'Opium operated from behind the city's administrative heart, a systematized monopoly that financed the colonial treasury. Every bridge that crossed the Saigon River, every kilometre of the Hanoi Railway bore its invisible signature. The local markets hummed with trade, rice, silk, tea, yet it was the state's control over the poppy that underwrote the illusion of prosperity. To visitors, Saigon appeared a triumph of civilization. To the accountants of the Régie, it was simply good business. Batavia, the empire's mirror in Batavia, capital of the Dutch East Indies, empire had aged into routine. The city was a labyrinth of canals and courtyards where the air carried the mingled scent of nutmeg, tobacco, and damp stone. Government buildings rose with austere Dutch precision, their white facades gleaming against the tropical sun. Here, the opium monopoly had become an institution older than memory. The patched system, under which private contractors managed sales under government supervision, had created dynasties of Chinese-Indonesian magnates. Their wealth built schools, hospitals, and temples, all funded by a commerce so normalized that it no longer required justification. Every transaction was recorded, every sale taxed, every indulgence calculated. The Dutch prided themselves on their balance sheets. They called it civil order. But in the silent mornings, when the canal mist hung low and the warehouses slept, Batavia felt less like a city of progress than a monument to endurance, the empire's quiet ability to turn desire into discipline. The rituals of control across these ports, trade followed a choreography as formal as any ceremony. Ships anchored at dawn, inspected by customs officers in pressed uniforms. Cargo was weighed, catalogued, and sealed with wax and ink. At midday, officials met in shaded offices to review figures, issue licenses, and discuss the next auction of distribution rights. Each act reinforced the empire's image of precision and order. The opium chests were not hidden. They were displayed in plain sight, labelled, numbered, and presented as legitimate merchandise. The system's success lay in its transparency. The empire had transformed vice into procedure, turning indulgence into an administrative virtue. In this choreography of bureaucracy, even morality had a timetable. The sound of empire, the ports had their own soundscape, one that captured the essence of the age. The low hum of steamboats, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the clicking of telegraph keys in the post offices. Every sound spoke of progress, yet each depended on the same financial rhythm, the tax revenues drawn from the poppy's resin. Without that income, the telegraph lines would have fallen silent, the lights gone dark, the harbour cranes stilled. Dependency had become infrastructure, invisible yet absolute. The empire's masquerade in the evenings, the colonial elite gathered in clubs overlooking the sea. The walls were hung with portraits of governors and admirals, their expressions serene and self-assured. Waiters in white served imported wine while orchestras played waltzes from Vienna. Conversation flowed easily, trade figures, shipping delays, the weather in Europe. No one mentioned the true foundation of their comfort. It did not need to be spoken. It was written in the city itself, in its roads, its buildings, its light. Empire had learned the art of disguise. The ports shone with order, but they were built on indulgence. They preached morality, yet they were financed by desire. Each city was a reflection of the same paradox: progress rising from dependency, beauty born from control. The pulse beneath the harbour as the century turned and modernity quickened its pace. The ports of Southeast Asia became symbols of global progress. Photographs of Singapore's quays and Saigon's boulevards were printed in European newspapers, celebrated as triumphs of civilization. But for those who worked behind the warehouses and counted the ships, the truth was simpler. These cities thrived on the rhythm of trade, not the virtue of empire. And as long as the tide came in and the ledgers balanced, the machinery of dependency would continue to turn, silent, steady, eternal. In every empire, indulgence required administration. By the early 20th century, the colonial governments of Southeast Asia had transformed pleasure into paperwork, euphoria into an institution. Behind every pipe lit in a narrow alley or every chest unloaded at a harbour warehouse stood an invisible army of clerks, accountants, and inspectors, the true architects of the empire's narcotic order. Their tools were simple: ink, paper, and discipline. Through them, the empire learned how to manage not only goods but desire itself. The paper empire, it began with documentation. Every shipment of opium, whether arriving from Bengal, Macau, or Yunnan, was catalogued in minutes recorded, seals affixed. In colonial offices from Saigon to Singapore, ledgers bound in leather filled with endless columns of figures. Here, dependency was rendered as data. The intoxicant became a statistic, its dangers converted into decimals and percentages. These offices were quiet, almost reverential spaces. The sound of pens scratching over paper replaced the roar of the docks. To the bureaucrat, there was comfort in the neatness of it all, in knowing that chaos could be contained within margins and measured in profit. In Singapore's opium department, reports were prepared monthly, quarterly, annually. Each described the same story with mathematical calm: revenue maintained, consumption stable, efficiency increased. The words were impersonal, almost serene. Through such language, the empire disguised indulgence as administration. The inspectors of order at the center of this machinery were the inspectors, men tasked with ensuring that every grain of resin was accounted for. They traveled between warehouses, measured inventory, and verified purity. Their reports described the texture of the substance, its weight, and its scent with the precision of a chemist and the detachment of a judge. Inspection in the colonial imagination was a moral act. It gave the illusion that control was equivalent to virtue. Each barrel bore a government seal, each transaction a receipt. The empire had learned to sanctify its commerce through ritual precision. To regulate was to justify. And so, every inspection became an act of purification, not of the substance, but of the conscience. The language of control colonial bureaucracy had a genius for language. It could turn moral contradiction into administrative vocabulary. In official reports, words like vice, addiction, and excess rarely appeared. Instead, one found consumption rates, fiscal contribution, and public discipline. This linguistic alchemy transformed the meaning of the trade. Where one might have spoken of human suffering, the empire spoke of its statistical anomalies. Where one might have questioned policy, the bureaucracy offered charts. The act of translation was deliberate. By changing the language, the empire changed reality. The narcotic trade ceased to be a moral issue and became a matter of management. In the offices of Batavia and Saigon, language served as insulation. It shielded officials from the consequences of their work, replacing emotion with procedure. Dependency became not an ailment, but a line item in a budget. The ritual of reports every quarter, colonial secretaries prepared detailed summaries for London, The Hague, or Paris. These reports were bound in embossed covers, printed on fine paper, and filled with tables of numbers. The data flowed upward through the hierarchy, transforming lived experience into administrative abstraction. A clerk's neat handwriting in Penang might become a statistic in a report to the House of Commons. A merchant's license renewal in Rangoon might appear as a line of revenue in a Dutch parliamentary debate. The further the data travelled, the purer it became, stripped of context, stripped of consequence. By the time it reached the desks of ministers, it was no longer a record of commerce, but a proof of civilization. The empire justified itself with its own arithmetic. The architecture of obedience, the offices themselves, reflected the ideology they produced. In Saigon, the Régie de l'Opium was housed in a pale neoclassical building with arched windows and marble floors. In Singapore, the Opium Department occupied a modest but orderly structure near the harbour. Each space was designed for clarity, light and hierarchy, desks aligned in rows, cabinets labelled, ledgers stacked by date. Discipline was both a method and a performance. Visitors noted the cleanliness, the punctuality, the calm. Everything about these places suggested moral authority, as though the neatness of the room could absolve the nature of its work. The empire's greatest illusion was that order equaled virtue, and no institution demonstrated that illusion better than the narcotic bureaucracy. The moral accountants, the men who managed this system, did not see themselves as profiteers. They were administrators, loyal to their duties, bound by regulations and deadlines. They did not question the morality of the trade any more than they questioned the rising of the sun. To them, the figures in their ledgers represented stability, a steady income that funded roads, hospitals, and schools. When confronted by critics in Europe, colonial officials often pointed to these achievements. Without the opium revenue, they argued, how shall we civilize the colonies? The justification was simple. The end redeemed the means. In this way, the bureaucracy transformed contradiction into logic. Euphoria financed education. Dependency built discipline. It was a perfect circle, one in which morality could always find a comfortable place, provided it stayed within the lines of an official report. The machine of rationality at its height, the opium bureaucracy was one of the most efficient systems of control in the modern world. It operated across oceans, languages, and empires with mechanical precision. The flow of information mirrored the flow of the drug itself, steady, contained, and carefully measured. There was no secrecy. Everything was written, recorded, and approved. That transparency was its shield. The empire did not hide its dependency, it merely rationalized it. Each government office became a small engine in a vast administrative organism, an empire not of force, but of paper. Here, policy replaced morality and procedure replaced doubt. The empire did not ask whether it should continue, it simply calculated how best to do so. The philosophy of administration in the end, the bureaucracy of bliss, was not an aberration, it was a philosophy. It embodied the empire's faith in systems, in measurable progress, in the quiet triumph of order over uncertainty. If indulgence could be recorded, taxed and controlled, then it could be made moral. This belief that regulation could purify became the moral cornerstone of colonial governance. It was the same reasoning that built railways and censuses, tax systems and schools. Control was virtue, precision was progress. The bureaucrats believed they were building a better world, one line of ink at a time. And perhaps in their own way they were, for they built a world where numbers mattered more than needs and where the human soul could be filed, stamped, and archived. History rarely ends with a crash. More often it fades. The great narcotic empires of Southeast Asia did not collapse in scandal or fire. They dissolved, quietly, under the weight of their own contradictions. By the early decades of the 20th century, the tide was turning. A new kind of light began to filter through the tropical haze. The light of reform, bureaucracy's own reckoning, and the slow awakening of conscience. The same systems that had once maintained perfect control began to show their cracks, not through rebellion, but through re-evaluation. The whisper of reform, it began in words. In London, Amsterdam, and Paris, committees convened in polite rooms to discuss a moral improvement and a public health. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, and deliberate. Reports once filled with profit margins now carried unfamiliar terms: a medical dependency, a public welfare, international cooperation. The first real challenge to the narcotic trade did not come from within Asia, but from the new moral anxieties of the West. Industrialization had transformed the world, but it had also reshaped the conscience of empire. What had once been seen as a matter of commerce was slowly reframed as a question of ethics. The conference tables between 1909 and 1912, a series of international conferences began to define the modern conversation about narcotics. The Shanghai Opium Commission, the first of its kind, gathered diplomats, colonial administrators, and physicians from across the world. They sat beneath chandeliers in rooms filled with paper, speaking in the precise, restrained tone of men who understood that the fate of millions could be decided by commas and clauses. For the first time, the trade that had shaped empires was being examined as a global problem. It was not condemned outright, not yet, but it was dissected, studied, and quantified in the language of progress. What had begun as a moral whisper now had a diplomatic voice. The bureaucrats of conscience in the colonies, the bureaucrats themselves, began to change. New generations of administrators, educated in the social sciences, returned from Europe with a different vision of duty. They still believed in order and discipline, but they also believed in reform. Their offices filled with new kinds of paperwork, health surveys, rehabilitation programs, and reports on an immoral improvement of labor. The old ledgers remained, but beside them appeared pamphlets, medical journals, and handbooks on social policy. The language of administration was shifting again, this time from control to concern. And yet, the rhythm of the trade did not immediately stop. Ships still arrived, warehouses still opened, taxes still flowed, but the confidence had gone. The empire continued to operate, though it no longer entirely believed in itself. The erosion of faith in commerce, in progress, in the righteousness of empire began to erode quietly. The world had changed. Wars had redrawn maps, industries had created new fortunes, and the European conscience had discovered new doubts. In Paris and London, citizens no longer spoke of opium as exotic or romantic. It had become a symbol of decline, of excess, of something incompatible with the modern age. The colonial project that once justified itself through civilization now faced the uncomfortable truth that its own prosperity had rested upon dependence. The change did not come from outrage, it came from fatigue. From the realization that the machinery of control was too heavy, too complex, too costly to maintain. The last profits, even as reform movements grew, the final years of the trade were paradoxically its most efficient. Governments sought to extract every remaining ounce of value before the inevitable end. Taxes were raised, licenses were tightened, purity standards increased. The system, knowing its time was near, turned inward, optimizing itself as if perfection might grant survival. But beneath the precision there was resignation. Officials spoke of orderly withdrawal, a gradual reduction, and a controlled elimination. The language of bureaucracy softened, as though trying to disguise the fading of an empire's most lucrative secret. The once gleaming offices of the opium rages grew quieter. The ledgers became thinner, the shipments fewer. The empire was not dismantled, it was archived. The shifting winds of power in Southeast Asia, a new kind of empire was forming, one built on rubber, tin, and oil rather than smoke. The world was entering the modern industrial age, and Euphoria no longer served as its currency. The colonies adapted. Warehouses that once held opium now stored machinery. Clerks who had once measured resin began recording freight schedules. The bureaucracy of bliss became the bureaucracy of progress. To the administrators, this was not an end but an evolution. They believed they were simply moving from one form of control to another, from pleasure to productivity, from indulgence to efficiency. The narcotic trade became a footnote in a larger history of empire, overshadowed by steel, science, and the coming of war. The forgotten archives by the 1930s, most of the great opium departments had been dissolved or absorbed into new ministries. Their ledgers were boxed, sealed, and stored in dusty archives. For decades, few opened them. When they were finally studied, historians found not tales of villainy, but of routine. The quiet diligence of men who believed they were managing necessity. The handwriting was careful, the arithmetic flawless, the tone neutral. There were no confessions, no apologies, only balance sheets. The empire had ended as it had lived, through the rhythm of record-keeping. The irony of order, the irony, was unmistakable. The same order that had sustained the empire's moral certainty now presided over its decline. It had created systems so precise that, when the world shifted, those systems could only record the collapse, not prevent it. And so, the end came not with rebellion or revelation, but with quiet paperwork, closure documents, revenue summaries, transition reports. A civilization that had once turned indulgence into administration now administered its own disappearance. The fading perfume of power in the humid evenings of Southeast Asia, the scent of the old trade lingered faintly, in the abandoned warehouses near the ports, in the stories whispered by older merchants, in the faint bitterness of memory. The empire had left behind no monuments to its narcotic age, only habits, of control, of paperwork, of measured indulgence, and perhaps that was its truest legacy. The belief that even desire could be made orderly, that even ruin could be rational. History closed the chapter with grace, not guilt. The world moved forward and the archives slept, but in the quiet corners of forgotten offices, among the ink-stained pages and fading stamps, one could still sense it. The ghost of an empire that once ruled through euphoria and ended through exhaustion. History does not end. It lingers, not in monuments or wars, but in habits, systems, and quiet continuities that stretch across centuries. The narcotic empires of colonial Southeast Asia vanished from sight, yet the structures they built, of profit, control, and dependence, remained reborn in new forms under new names. The story of euphoria and empire did not conclude with the closing of the last opium warehouse. It merely changed its costume. The legacy of control when the great narcotic bureaucracies dissolved. Their administrators did not disappear. They became the architects of new systems, customs departments, taxation bureaus, public health ministries. The same meticulous methods once used to track resin and revenue were now applied to regulate tobacco, spirits, and pharmaceuticals. The empire had not lost its appetite for control, only its subject. In the post-colonial era, the languages of morality and administration merged once again. Governments spoke of a public welfare, economic stability, and a health regulation. Yet beneath these noble words lay the same ancient equation. That desire, if properly managed, could be profitable. The empire's ghost still whispered through the paperwork of modern states. The moral residue, every system leaves a moral residue, a way of thinking that outlives the system itself. In the case of the narcotic empire, it was the belief that pleasure could be governed, that indulgence could be purified through rules. This idea migrated silently into modernity. By the mid-20th century, as global institutions debated laws, prohibitions, and medical policies, the shadow of the colonial approach remained visible. Regulation replaced dialogue, punishment replaced understanding, even reform became administrative. The same logic that once justified the trade, control through order, now justified its suppression. It was, in a sense, the empire's final victory. It taught the world to moralize through management. The economics of desire beyond morality, the economic legacy endured as well. The ports that once handled opium became hubs for global trade. The merchant houses of Penang, Singapore, and Batavia evolved into corporate dynasties, channeling capital into shipping, banking, and industry. The infrastructure built to move narcotics, warehouses, ships, and customs routes became the arteries of globalization. In this way, the narcotic trade helped construct the very skeleton of the modern economy. Its profits funded roads, schools, and telegraph lines. Its losses taught the empire the limits of monopoly. Even in decay it built. The world inherited not the substance, but the structure. The archive of forgetting every empire, when it falls, writes its own silence. The colonial archives that once documented the narcotic trade were eventually classified, condensed, and forgotten. Historians who opened them decades later found not moral outrage but indifference, rows of ledgers, inspection records, and official seals. In those quiet documents, one could read the tone of the age, restrained, practical, and profoundly detached. The moral drama had never been written down, only the arithmetic survived. And perhaps that is what the empire desired most, to outlast memory through paperwork, because paper endures. It yellowed, but it did not burn. The cultural reflection in the cities once built upon the trade, echoes lingered in unexpected places, in architecture, in ritual, in art. The neoclassical opium offices became museums, libraries, or government departments. The very streets where merchants once bargained became tourist districts, their histories softened into heritage. The narcotic age had become a story, a cautionary tale told without bitterness, its sharper edges worn away by time. What was once a question of power now belonged to the aesthetics of memory. And yet, in the rhythm of modern cities, in the pulse of trade, the hum of bureaucracy, the obsession with progress, something familiar still moved. The empire had taught its children to measure everything, even desire, in units, taxes, and returns. The modern inheritance today, the global systems that govern trade, finance, and regulations still carry faint traces of that colonial logic. The belief that indulgence can be controlled through precision remains embedded in institutions, from health ministries to financial boards. Every form stamped, every number logged, every regulation passed, it all belongs to a lineage that began in those quiet offices of the 19th century. The narcotic age trained the world to think of pleasure not as a mystery, but as a commodity, not as a weakness, but as something to be catalogued, taxed, and supervised. We live still in that inheritance, in a world shaped by the machinery of measurement. The philosophy of forgetting as decades turned to centuries, the empire's legacy faded into abstraction. No one speaks of the old drug lords anymore, or the bureaucrats who served them. Their portraits hang in obscure archives, their names footnotes in economic histories. But their influence remains in the invisible habits of governance, in the way nations manage risk, desire, and dependency. History's greatest illusions are never destroyed. They are absorbed. The narcotic empire did not die. It was transformed into modern rationality. What was once a vice became a variable. What was once euphoria became efficiency. The quiet echo, if one listens carefully, the echo remains. In the rustle of old paper, in the logic of reports, in the faint scent of dust and ink that fills colonial archives. It speaks not of guilt or grandeur, but of continuity, of how empires survive not through conquest, but through their ideas. The dream of control, born in the humid ports of Southeast Asia, traveled farther than any ship or merchant ever could. It became a philosophy that all human impulses, even the wildest, could be made orderly. And so, centuries later, the empire's final whisper still drifts through history. That civilization, in its quest for perfection, will always find a way to make even euphoria administrative.